Hello everyone, I'm Terry Duke and welcome to this new improvised series called Duke Stories, where I share with you some interesting stories from my life and how they shaped my political views today for mild entertainment. The main inspiration for this came from a YouTuber I used to watch years ago called Bullet Barry, and he had his own Barry Stories playlist where he did exactly what I just described with some gameplay footage as background visuals, and so here I am doing the exact same thing. Today I want to talk about my brief right-wing phase, and how ultimately I was always going to get out of it without ever falling too deep. Not because I was particularly smarter, not because I came from a left-leaning household, but because I had already experienced one of the most effective paths to deradicalization you can take before I was ever exposed to right-wing content. And to tell this story, we need to go all the way back to 2016. 2016 was the year that saw the biggest rise in reactionary content online. Coming out of Gamergate that had started 2 years before, there was also a lot of stuff going on in the world. Donald Trump was becoming the new leading figure of the American right by speaking of building a literal wall on the border to stop rapists and drug dealers from entering. In the Middle East, ISIS was rising in power and strength, which led to a huge wave of refugees fleeing to Europe, where a few terror attacks, most notably I think the Paris terror attacks, occurred in late 2015, which led to widespread anti-refugee sentiment across the West. And to top it all, the left's online presence was either not really there or optically really bad. In 2016, if you were a normie jumping into adulthood, going on the internet and seeing politics for the first time, it could be kind of overwhelming. You could see someone like Trump saying the most outrageous things on TV, and just from being from a mildly liberal family, you could think, obviously this is outrageous. But at the same time, if you looked at the mainstream news, the only thing you'd ever hear about is some terror attack that just occurred or a humanitarian crisis in Europe, so was there some truth to what the right was saying? At the same time, we were seeing the evolution of Gamergate, so to speak, which went from a cyberbullying campaign against feminism being brought into video games to targeting feminism and virtually any other form of social justice everywhere else it could be found. And as I've said, the online left in 2016 was really bad. If you were a normie who knew little about politics, who were you more likely to listen to? Someone who appears composed, who seems down to earth and relates to your fears of change and difference? Or someone who screams in your face about how you're wrong and racist? Now, of course, that was the depiction painted by the right, but these videos did exist, and they were being spread, so it's not like they were completely made up. At the same time, if you were listening to the left, you'd also hear a lot of weird stuff, this is when the idea of more genders came around, and it was a lot easier to make fun of it than to trying to understand it. But that's when it started for me. I entered this online sphere in early 2016. I remember being at home for the holidays, and my brother passing by me in the kitchen while listening to a video on his iPad. I couldn't see the video, but I could hear some guy making fun of feminists. That guy was Hunter Avallone, and as someone with no investment in politics at the time, I just thought of feminism as something neutral, It's about equality between men and women, fine, whatever. But Hunter was making jokes and skits at the time about how feminism was actually cringe and outdated, without necessarily ever coming off as anti-woman or anti-equality. For the Anti-SJWs at the time, the arguments made wasn't that women shouldn't have equality, but that they already had it, and that feminism today is useless. And every video he made fermented this notion by looking at the online left from 2016 and making fun of SJW's appearance, their quickness to anger, and how it was all just embarrassing. Suddenly, making fun of feminism felt both edgy and correct. It felt funny to look at a movement that should generally be a simple, good thing to support, and destroy the movement's proponents with facts and logic, and see them get enraged, or triggered as we used to say. And it certainly felt a lot easier to watch content that did that sort of thing, than to focus on the broader geopolitics that certainly felt overwhelming in comparison. And so from 2016 to early 2019, those were my main anti-SJW years. There's a lot of content nowadays that explores what is now known as the alt-right pipeline. There's a couple of videos by Innuendo Studios and Three Arrows that explore the topic, but the gist of it was that the more anti-SJW content you watched, the more of it the YouTube algorithm would push on you. And this pipeline would eventually lead you towards right-wing figures that held more controversial views, and the more you watched those, the more you'd see of it, until inevitably you get a recommendation of someone more extreme that leads you to someone else, and so on. Looking back at this content, I understand much better why it was so appealing. Anti-SJW content never challenged you. Instead, it reassured you, it coddled you. It would say that you're right for hating political correctness, you're right for believing feminism is outdated, and here's a bunch of whiny snowflakes to make fun of. Is it not enough to merely make fun of them? Well, how about destroying them with facts and logic? It was entertaining, and in some way it could even feel empowering, although in all the worst ways, really. But that's really all my phase was about. Feminism was outdated, social justice warriors are cringe, and facts and logic are the way to go. I remember distinctively though, one day I was watching Hunter Avalon, and a video he made on Muslims came up. The video was, well, very racist. In terms of the alt-right pipeline in 2016, Islamophobia was generally the next step to radicalization, and everyone on the right inevitably went there. They would lure you in with what appeared to be very genuine, obvious criticisms of SJWs, but the next thing you know, they'd talk about the Muslim refugees. First they'd scare you by bringing up terror attacks, then they would suggest that it's not just a few extremists, but the entire religion, the entire culture. And if you listened long enough, the next step would be along the lines of the Great Replacement, the idea that Muslims and brown people are so numerous that they are going to replace white people. From there, you're introduced to white nationalism, and the idea that white European cultures are under threat of extinction because of immigration. And from there, if you keep going, you'd start asking why all of this is happening, and who is orchestrating all of this. And from there, if you're really committed, you'll end up here. Now, the reason I say my anti-SJW phase was rather brief is because I never made it past this next step of demonizing Muslim refugees. To his credit, Hunter Avalon never did either, but the reason I never did is because I already had personal experience with Muslims and immigrants by that point. Very positive experiences, I might add. The first of which was in 2013. Back then I was still a teenager living in my quiet little hometown out in the country where there was virtually no diversity at all. Back then I was already showing an interest for movies and camera work, and so I was offered to shoot a promotional video for this local employment agency. This agency had some kind of outreach program seeking to invite a lot of highly skilled workers from the big cities to come and visit the region for a whole weekend and see what kind of career opportunities they might have. But I digress. The point is that my first experience with immigrants was following a group of people for 3 days while they visited my home region and filming the whole thing for a promotional video. In this group we had several Muslims from West and North Africa and from the Middle East, as well as a couple of Europeans. Many of them were engineers, technicians, or other highly trained professionals in their fields, and they were also some of the kindest people I had ever met. They were polite, friendly, and I would often talk with them during the trips, asking them where they were from, what they thought of the region, and sometimes even cracking jokes with them. I remember distinctively this woman telling me of when she first landed in Canada during the winter and how she had never seen snow in her entire life. And so as soon as she got off the plane, she bent down and grabbed a handful of snow with her bare hand and was just amazed. It was cute. My first experience with immigrants was genuinely wholesome, but I wouldn't really have another experience until 2 years later, in 2015, when I moved to the big city for college. It was an intense course that only lasted 8 months, and our class, although small, was surprisingly diverse. Out of 12 students in the class, only 5 of us, I would say, were fully fledged white Quebecers, as in born in Quebec, French is our first language, and the same goes for both of our parents. 2 students were mixed, in that one was a Quebecer and the other an immigrant, and the rest were all immigrants from Egypt, Algeria, Cameroon, France, and Spain. For 8 months I was in that class, getting to know them, working on all kinds of film and TV projects with them. And those were some of the best times in my life. College life, moved out of my parents' house, I was a young adult with lots of ambition and energy. And I undeniably met some amazing people during that time, some of which I've worked with on different projects after school was over. So I graduated in 2015, I started my anti-SJW phase in 2016, and as soon as I started going down the alt-right pipeline, the next talking point after feminism bad was Muslims bad. We need a Muslim ban, Muslim refugees are destroying Europe, they're all secretly terrorists, etc. And that was where I essentially blocked, because I could not reconcile this demonization of Muslims with my own personal experience, which had only been positive. And at the time, this is where the entire online right was headed. It was the further that Hunter Avalon had gone, but it was also coming from people like Milo Yiannopoulos. Snowflake destroyer Ben Shapiro would also bring his facts and logic into his video about Islam and violence, which got millions of views. Lauren Southern, who would initially make fun of feminism, now would fly abroad, speak of the Great Replacement, and literally make a video called The Streets of Paris, whose sole purpose is to show how diverse Paris is. And I've been walking down Montreal for the past 2 years and seeing the exact same thing there. Like, no one is doing anything. The video was literally just like, oh my god, look at all the brown people. I could never digest any of that stuff. If anything, I found the anti-immigrant rhetoric so wrong and disgusting at the time that watching it would essentially trigger me. I'd get very argumentative in right-wing comment sections, I would essentially become the snowflake on that one issue because I would get passionate. I even remember a brief exchange with my brother where one time he sent me a Hunter Avalon video with the caption, "My man." The video was about a terror attack in London for which Hunter commented at the time that terrorism isn't the problem, that Islam is the problem. This led to a brief exchange with my brother where I told him that this was the one issue over which Hunter was completely wrong. My brother, bless his heart, never cared enough about politics to hold any opinions strongly enough to debate them, at least not with me. And to be clear, this was like 6 years ago now, so I think we've both had our own journeys since. So by 2018, I had a rather weird and embarrassing period, as I was slowly getting off the right-wing algorithm, where because I enjoyed watching anti-feminist videos, but avoided any video that railed against immigrants, I thought of myself as like a centrist. Like, yeah, feminism is cringe, but all the Islamophobia is just wrong, so like, I agree with some of the right-wing content, but not all of it, so I'm a centrist. Eventually, the anti-feminist content got redundant and boring, and through my own experiences talking to even more people, especially when I began online dating, I slowly let go of all of it. And then by 2019, the online left had gotten its shit together. YouTubers like Destiny, regardless of what you think of him today, at the time, he was demolishing anti-SJWs like no bullshit. He had crushed Lauren Southern in a debate. Essayists like H. Bomber Guy, Sean, Three Arrows, Innuendo Studios, ContraPoints, among many others, they were all out there surgically debunking every single right-wing talking points. Even Hunter Avalon, who got me into anti-SJW content to begin with, would eventually debate Vosh and later have a political shift on his own. He still makes content today, but as a leftist, which is like the most wholesome thing I've ever seen in the online political space. A lot of people were gradually deradicalized, often just as quickly as they entered right-wing content. In my case though, and this is the main point of this video, the reason I never got further into the pipeline isn't because I was better or smarter than people who went further, it's because I was lucky enough to get the personal exposure necessary to end bigotry before it ever had time to fester at all. That's not to say exposure itself solves all bigotry and ignorance, but exposure is, in my opinion, one of the biggest factors in deradicalization. The right-wing content could present itself as fact and logic all at once, and debunking videos by the left can be very effective, but they can only go so far. When you've spent years hearing the same talking points, you're not going to just change your mind when better facts are presented. However, we do have countless stories of people who have been deradicalized simply by exposure. Back when the anti-Muslim sentiment was raging, there were also stories of people making friends with their new neighbors and through those experiences, ridding themselves of all the bigotry and fearmongering they had been exposed to. This guy from that one picture of the far-right rally in Charlottesville, he was later deradicalized by talking to a Muslim woman. And we see the same thing in the media all the time. One of my favorite films is Gran Torino, and that movie is about an old racist who gets to know his new neighbors and comes to deeply care for them despite initially hating them. I made a video recently about a trans character from Squid Game 2 and how an old lady who is initially put off by her eventually comes to love and respect her by just getting to know her. Exposure, getting to know people on a personal level, is the one thing the far right cannot do anything about. This is also why the people most likely to be radicalized by the online right are isolated, lonely young men. No one with a social life bothers with that content, and no one in a diverse social group turns out racist either. And if you want to take this trend even further, you can see a clear political disparity between people who live in cities and people who live in rural areas. Big cities are where people tend to be more diverse, and rural areas tend not to be. So big cities tend to lean left because of exposure, while rural areas tend to lean right because they're isolated. Coming back again to my own story, back when I moved to Montreal in 2015, right before I moved, my ex's mother at the time told me that once I get there, the sudden abundance of people of color would turn me racist. Which was massive projection now that I think about it. But at the time, I also had a friend from high school that had moved to Montreal a year before I did. And when we finally saw each other again after I moved, I shared that comment with her. And she told me that actually, it's the exact opposite. Seeing so much diversity would make me more accepting of it. And she was absolutely right. That's how it works for everybody. Now, I also want to make clear, while I do believe exposure is something that everyone needs, my story is my own, and mine was not only affected by my life experiences before I started watching right-wing content, it was also by and large affected by what I was doing before that. When Gamergate was actually happening, I had no idea. I never went on 4chan, I was never on Reddit or Twitter. My internet experience in 2014 was using Facebook to talk with my friends outside of high school and watching funny videos on YouTube. And most of my time spent on the computer wasn't on the internet to begin with. I was usually playing video games, in single player to top it all off. I was still playing CD-based games on Windows XP. I only had one game on Steam. There's a lot of ways people could at the time, and still could today really, fall into right-wing content. I mean seriously, teenage boys watching Sneako today have a very different experience of the internet than I did at their age. But I would still argue that regardless of who you are, where you come from, or how you got to your political views today, in general, the best thing that could happen to you is getting to socialize with people of different cultures than yours. That's what did it for me, that's what did it for a lot of people. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.